Hello everyone, this is Nitpicking Nerd, and today I want to talk about one of my favorite movies of all time, Back to the Future, and I'm going to discuss the time traveling, the timelines, and this will be an extremely nitpicking video, and all of this is just for fun, of course, and these are all comedy movies, and so a little bit of illogical mistakes are fine. It doesn't really ruin the movie for me, but I would still like to discuss it and maybe even try to come up with theories to try to explain away all the plot holes and all the things that doesn't seem to make sense. So let us begin by drawing the original timeline. This is the original timeline. The movie starts in the year 85. Doc Brown demonstrates his first time travel jump when he sends his dog 1 minute into the future, so the very first time jump is here. And the dog disappears in that minute in which he is sent into the future. The dog no longer exists in that minute, so this is important for later. Then Marty is sent 30 years into the past. I write Marty 1 because it's going to get messy later. Now, in the original timeline, George was a total loser, and after Marty goes back in time and changes things, George becomes successful, so this will be my way to distinguish these two timelines. We can also use the 2-pine mall as a visual proof of this, because in the original timeline, the mall was called the 2-pine mall. And Marty goes back to the future, but the future he arrives is this new future in which George is successful and not a loser. And we see that his mother is now not alcoholic and not fat. We see that his brother is successful, his sister is successful, his whole family is different, and Biff is now the loser. Biff is the one doing the car washes. I guess after he got his car dirty with manure so many times in the past, he decided to just clean it himself, and then he went into that business. So this is all a new and better timeline. The problem logically is why is there not a second Marty now? Because there is another Marty that lived in this new timeline, and he must be also different from our Marty. And so we did see that other Marty also being sent back into the past in the end of the first movie. So what happened with that other Marty? That is a very big question I'm going to discuss. And so we have another time jump which we witnessed of the second Marty. Marty 2. And presumably that Marty might also change the timeline again and then arrive into a new future. So I will draw another possible timeline in which that other Marty returns to, but we don't get to see it. Now, some people would argue maybe he simply became the Marty we see, that they somehow merged together, meaning the second Marty, maybe he was completely identical personality-wise and he did exactly the same things, and so they basically fulfill the same loop. I tend to doubt that because it doesn't fit with what we see in the rest of the trilogy, and also I will use this second Marty to explain a different plot hole which happens in the second movie, because as we see even in the end of the first movie, Doc went into the future, then came back, and then took Marty and his girlfriend Jennifer into the future, and yet they were still in the future, which doesn't really make sense. So let me draw it. And so we know that Doc traveled to the future of 2015. He didn't like what he saw there, and so he went back in time and then took Jennifer and Marty into that future, and yet they were still in that future, which doesn't really make sense, because as we've seen in the very first time travel, when he sent his dog into the future 1 minute, it did not exist for that 1 minute, and so when it arrived in the future, there was not another dog there. The dog disappeared the moment that he sent it to the future, and so how come when he sends Marty and Jennifer into the future, they are still in the future, as if they never disappeared? We can explain it because the time travel somehow knew that they were going to get back, and that's why they were there, but then how come they don't remember everything that happened before if they time jumped in the past already? And so that's why it doesn't really make sense unless there are duplicates of them. And that is why I said the second Marty in the beginning actually would make sense, because that would explain why there is a second Marty in the future. So it's possible that the initial time travel of Marty created a duplicate Marty who also came back into the same future maybe, and then lived on his life normally until 2015. And so the second Marty, who was a stranger to this second timeline, because he was not from there, he's the one who gets sent into the future. And so the other Marty lived a normal life, never knowing about another time jump he did before 2015. And so he lived normally, he became a loser Marty, and then the Marty from the first timeline arrived here in the future. So the second Marty would actually make sense because Marty time traveled in the past, creating a duplicate of himself, but why was there another Jennifer there? And that's the big problem, that in order to explain it, I will have to invent a whole other temporal adventure with Jennifer, which we just didn't get to see. So maybe at some point, Doc went back and took Jennifer somewhere in the past and created another time loop. Maybe that can explain why the actress of Jennifer changed her appearance so much. Maybe it's an alternate Jennifer because of some other events, and so there might be a second Jennifer. I will discuss that in length separately later to try to explain why there was a second Jennifer who lived out her life until 2015 and didn't know anything until she encountered her previous self and was surprised by it. So if it happened in her past, she wouldn't be surprised, and so that obviously had to be a duplicate Jennifer. So then things get even more messy. So this is the future when old Biff is a loser, and then he steals the time machine and goes back to 55 to change the past. He takes the book with all the sport events from the future and he goes back to 55. And then immediately goes back before the change in the timeline took effect, and so he returns to the same point where he left, and then Marty and Doc, not knowing anything, go back to 85, but by the time they arrive in 85, this will be the alternate 85 in which Biff is now rich. And I will call this timeline Hell Valley. And so they can no longer go back to the future because they will arrive to the future of this new timeline. So to prevent it and to fix all of this mess, they have to go back and they leave Jennifer in that altered future, which is something I will discuss later, and only Marty and Doc go back to 55 to prevent Biff from changing the past. And so yet another timeline is created after they fix the situation, after Biff again becomes loser Biff, and 85 is restored to exactly what we saw in the second timeline when George was successful and Biff was a loser. That's apparently the final timeline that we see in the end of the third movie. And I'm kind of discounting everything that happened in the Old West, which might have caused some changes as well, but apparently it did not cause any major changes because everything looks exactly as it did in the end of the first movie, with George being successful and Biff washing their car and all of that. And as for the future, I guess it remains unknown because now they are aware of their own future, so they will probably change it for the better, so it will not be the same future which we saw in 2015. Now, the strange thing is that they left Jennifer in that Hell Valley alternate timeline, and yet she somehow woke up in the normal timeline which was fixed, which is kind of strange because wouldn't she simply get stuck in that other timeline? So somehow she appears in this new timeline and she remembers everything she saw in 2015. So it is the same Jennifer, it's not a different Jennifer who just happens to be in the same place. So my question is, wouldn't there be a second Jennifer here? Wouldn't there be a duplicate of Jennifer who lived in this timeline normally? And this other Jennifer would appear as if from an alternate timeline. So that's also a possibility, but maybe it can explain what I complained about previously, about there being another Jennifer in 85 who is able to travel to the future and there would be another older Jennifer there. So maybe all of these events kind of explain it. Maybe there was always an alternate timeline and another Jennifer who popped up from that alternate timeline. So all of this might explain my original complaint about the second Jennifer in the second movie existing. So maybe because they left another Jennifer in a separate timeline, it somehow created a duplicate of her, which existed even before, because this is all in 4 dimensions. It's all not really in the order we see it, and there might be other timelines which we are not familiar about. So maybe Doc tried to change the past a few more times before what we saw in the end of the first movie. And then he took the other Jennifer who doesn't know anything together with Marty in the end of the first movie, but there was actually another Jennifer already because of something that Doc did off screen with her, and so it's possible to explain it by inventing some kind of theory. And there might be many more problems which remain unsolved in the very end in the third movie. There might be other duplicates of Marty and Jennifer still existing because we know that Marty came to a new timeline which looks like the one from the first movie, but it should technically be a new timeline as well because of all the changes they did in the past. Because in the year 55, Doc accidentally got sent back in time to 1885 and prevented the death of that school teacher, but because he later left with her to the future, then he removed her from the past, and so it's the same as if she died. So maybe the changes were not huge, but there should still be some changes, and so there should be another timeline created in which that valley in which she fell into in the original timeline will now be called Eastwood Valley because everyone thought that's where he died. the Marty was in the past who called himself Eastwood. He and Doc stole a train and crashed it into that valley, and then it got named the Eastwood Valley, not like in the original timeline. So all of this should be in another timeline in the end. And when they go back to 85, the fixed 85 as I call it, there should be multiple copies of Marty and Doc and Jennifer now. And so we don't really get to see what happens next, but technically when they all go back home there should be different versions of them. So I guess they will have to kind of live separately. Maybe Jennifer and Marty have to leave their family and go live somewhere else so that they will not encounter their other versions. But that's something we never get to see because there were never any more sequels. So that's kind of a just for fun video. Maybe I'll do another video later on to explain some of the problems I mentioned, but this was just a general schematic. So let me know what you think and we can discuss it in the comment section below, and I will see you all next time. Bye bye.